Is fine-tuning powerful evidence for God's existence? That's
Yes.
the question. Oh, shut up! That's the question that my two guests will be discussing today. Both have been on the channel before, but I'll introduce them anyway. So one guest is Troy Dana. He runs the excellent channel Friction Philosophy. And of course, he has published the best paper that I've ever read on Grim Reaper paradoxes. That is a completely unbiased judgment. I put links to Troy's YouTube channel, his Phil Papers profile, and his Substack in the description. The other guest is Matthew Adelstein, who has an excellent Substack called Bentham's Bulldog. He also has a YouTube channel and Phil Papers profile that I've linked in the description. Oh, and one other thing before we get into the discussion, Bonus Soccer has returned, so that'll be at the end of today's video. But without further ado, let's start with the articulation of the fine-tuning argument itself, turning it over to Matthew.
Yeah, thanks, Joe, for having me, and thanks, Troy, for doing this. The basic idea of the fine-tuning argument is relatively straightforward. Around 1980, and continuing to the present day, physicists discovered that there are certain parameters in physics which fall in a very narrow range needed for the formation of complex structures. The cosmological constant, for instance, falls in a tiny range, about 1 in 10 to the 120th of the values it could have taken on. And if it didn't fall in this very tiny range, you would not get any life at all. If it were a bit weaker, then everything would immediately collapse in on itself. If it were a bit stronger, everything would immediately fly apart. In each case, after less than a millisecond, there would be no matter that was not either, thrust apart or collapsed into a supermassive black hole. In either case, one should be rather pessimistic about the possibility of life. This is often touted by theists as being a good reason to believe in God, where the idea is if there's a God who sets the constants and wants to bring about things of value, then it makes a lot of sense that the constants would be set in this narrow range so that they would give rise to complex structures and to life more broadly. While if the constants, nothing sets them, then the probability that they would happen to fall in this very narrow range, which is improbable roughly on the order of throwing a dart across the known universe and hitting a particular atom, it's very unlikely that it would fall in this particular range. An analogy might be, suppose there's some guy who his favorite number is like 7.1993412. And then you measure the length of his table, and it's like exactly that many feet. You would say, well, that's probably not an accident because it's so unlikely it would be that particular thing by chance. Similarly, it's really unlikely that you'd get that value by chance, but it's much likelier that you'd get it if it were set. That's the sort of core idea of the fine-tuning argument.
All right, and then we'll turn over to Troy for a sort of presentation on some of his criticisms of fine-tuning.
Yeah, very good. Thank you. And thanks, Joe, for having me, and Matthew for joining to have a conversation. Hopefully this can go better than your conversation a few weeks ago with another Matthew, who I will not name.
Yeah, that's a claim. That's a claim. That's not an argument.
Yeah, exactly. So actually, I want to start with, let me make sure I can. Yeah, so I actually want to start going over some of the potential objections that I'm not going to be making today, and then eventually get to the objection that I am making, and we'll talk about that. So first, I'm not going to question the data of fine-tuning, right? So I'm just going to grant that, of all the ways you could have a universe with the kind of observed parameters, the vast majority would have like values of the constants and so on that are not life permitting. So I do think this might be questioned, in part because it involves, considering only universes that have the observed parameters, which doesn't exhaust the broader possibility space. I know there's a response to that, but I think there's actually potentially some issues with that. No, I'm not going to go into that now, since I'm going to grant it anyway. But there's an interesting discussion that can be had there. There's other points that can be raised here about the data fine-tuning. People might point out that there's no canonical measure over the space. There's potential arbitrariness involved with truncating or partitioning an infinite space like this. And so on. Maybe some of these points are fair. I'm not going to comment further on it here. I'm just going to grant, again, for sake of the discussion, that the bare data fine-tuning, as I briefly articulated, it is correct. I included a couple references there at the bottom, but discuss some of these issues. I should have included Barnes as well, because he discusses the reply that I hinted at. Anyway, I'm also not going to talk about the multiverse at all, or more generally to any sort of model where the parameters vary by time or place. It's not really the multiverse per se, which is the only way to get that result. You might think that the universe is big and varies parameters by time or place. So you get effectively the same result. I'm not going to make that point. Part of why I'm not going to bring this up is that, well, I think the quote unquote this universe reply and the stuff about the inverse Gambler's fallacy objection is kind of correct, or at least if the argument is otherwise fine, this is a correct reply. I could talk about that a bit more, but again, I don't feel the point in getting into that now because I'm just going to grant for sake of discussion that, well, I'm not even going to consider the possibility of a multiverse or the multiverse objection to the fine-tuning argument. So yeah, for simplicity, I'm just going to be comparing single universe models, say single universe design versus single universe no design. But yeah, the analysis might be complicated a little bit if we allow in variations like multiverses and even no universes or whatever. For a couple of articles discussing some related issues here, I included some citations at the bottom. Yeah, I'm not going to also, well, generally, I mean, some issues of divine psychology might come up, sort of, but for the most part, I'm not going to make any critiques about divine psychology. In particular, I'm not going to question, well, how is it, how likely is it that, say, a perfect being would be disposed to create a universe with life-permitting conditions? Maybe some people think that, well, we have no idea. Maybe it's inscrutable, or maybe it's incredibly low. I'm not going to question this at all. And there's a few reasons for this. One is that even if that is correct, which it's not obvious to me that it is, it seems to me that the design hypothesis could be modified fairly trivially to avoid it. At least it might be argued anyway. So I'm going to assume that theism for this discussion, or the target design hypothesis, at least moderately predicts that there'd be life-permitting conditions. And indeed, note that moderately here might be quite modest, right? It might be 1 in 10 to the 20 or so, or even less. But so long as the unlikelihood of life-permitting conditions on the alternative, on non-design, is many orders of magnitude lower than that, and we have a reasonable constraint on the priors, it's not going to matter. It's still going to, the data is still going to strongly favor design. So yeah, I include a couple articles discussing related issues here. Note that, I cited Cindy Babu's Electrons and Love article. That's one case where, okay, if even if that's correct, all right, well, what if I take a design hypothesis where it does predict sort of complex embodied life of the sort that we see here? Maybe even if we grant that some sort of bare design hypothesis that doesn't build in something like that wouldn't more strongly predict life-permitting conditions. Well, okay, it doesn't. It's arguably, if the argument is otherwise fair, we could modify our design hypothesis without significantly lowering the prior, but more moderately predicting life-permitting conditions of the sort that we see. So, I mean, that seems to me a fair response to some of these divine psychology worries, assuming that the argument is otherwise reasonable. So yeah, just a couple other things I'm not going to go over or not going to raise as concerns, except to say that I'm not going to raise them as concerns, which is maybe a bit of a form of contradiction, but whatever. I'm not going to bring up worries about like necessity or whether there's deeper laws. Maybe the constants and laws are the result of certain deeper, more unified laws, and those don't require much or any fine tuning. Yeah, I'm not going to bring that up. I'm also not going to question whether the sort of the fine-tuning argument style reasoning suggests that God was designed, although depending on how the argument's phrased, that might be a worry. I'm not going to question the general applicability of Bayesian style reasoning to the present issues, though I know some people who would do that. And yeah, I'm not going to raise, there's a bunch of other objections that people might raise, that like making unhelpful and irrelevant distinctions between evidence and evidence for, or anything like that. At this point, you might think, okay, I've basically covered everything. Like, how have I not granted too much to the proponent of the fine-tuning argument? What is left to critique? Haven't I just granted all the premises and all the, and just granted the, for sake of discussion, at least, that all the main objections that have been raised don't work or are not true? I don't think so. And now I'm going to get into my critique. I wrote a blog post on this a couple years ago, which has the basic idea. I'm going to be introducing a few more things about it, but the idea is basically the same.
Yeah, that blog post is linked in the description, by the way, for the audience, and I've also linked some blog posts from Matthew on the fine-tuning argument in the description.
Sweet. So my basic critique is going to be presented as an argument, right? Where the conclusion of which is that the data that there's life permitting conditions does not favor design to non-design. And before giving the argument, just for clarity, I just want to go over a couple of terms that I'm going to be using sort of throughout my discussion here. One is called the bare design thesis, which I'm going to call D from now on. And this thesis says there's exactly one universe and it was designed. And the bare non-design thesis says there's exactly one universe and it was not designed. And what I'm going to argue is that we have reason to think that the fact that L, where L is that there are life permitting conditions, does not favor D to N. In other words, our posterior on D given L is not greater than our posterior on N given L, given constraints that I'm going to argue for. All right. With that in mind, just to be clear, of course, the theist or design proponent doesn't have to be merely committed to bare design. I'm not supposing that is the quote unquote design thesis. It's just going to be relevant to my argument. And my argument is going to generalize to every design hypothesis. All right. Here's the basic argument. Okay. I'll just read through it and I'll give a more formal statement of the premises here in the after I go through it. Premise 1, the prior probability of D of the bare design hypothesis is not greater than the prior probability of N. It may come up, but I actually think this is an extremely generous assumption, but whatever, that's the first premise. Premise 2, the probability that L conditional on D is not greater than L conditional on N. Premise 3, any more substantive design hypothesis is not more probable than D when both are conditioned on the data that L. This is actually just like a theorem of probability, or false from one anyway. 4, D is not more probable than N when both are conditioned on the data that L. This actually just follows from 1 and 2. 5, any more substantive design hypothesis is not more probable than N when both are conditioned on the data that L. This follows from 3 and 4 by transitivity of the less than or equal to relation. 6 just says that L, that there are life permitting conditions. And so, in conclusion, hence our posterior on D, or any more substantive design hypothesis, is not greater than our posterior on N. Now, in discussion, I may need to clarify some of the stuff here, either for the audience or for the discussion. We'll see. Here's a slightly more formal statement of the same argument. You can see it's all the same 7 premises there, but it's expressed in more, well, probabilistic notation. I don't think I need to explain any more of the details of the basic argument now. I'll just kind of briefly go over some of the support for the key. Really, all the work is being done by premises 1 and 2, and really premise 2 is the main one. And that's the one that I expect to get pushback on. Maybe someone would push back on 1, but that's, well, anyway. Yeah, so just thinking about some reasons to think that 1 and 2 are correct. Briefly, I assume we'll get more into this. Well, we're going to get more into this in the course of my presentation here, but I assume we'll get more into it in the course of the discussion. Regarding 1, yeah, I mean, if we're just comparing the thesis that there's a single universe and it was designed, and the single universe and it wasn't designed, those seem like, I mean, fairly similar theses. I don't see reason to think that the design one would be much more probable, like antecedently, than the non-design one, before updating on any data about what the universe is like. So, and actually, I think there's reason to think that it probably should be much lower. The design one should be much lower, but at the very least, it seems reasonable to think that, to assign priors that are of the sort that satisfy my constraint 1. And then, and then the second premise, recall, was that the probability that L, that there are life permitting conditions conditional on D, that there's a single universe and it wasn't designed is not greater than the probability that L conditional on N, that there's a single universe and it wasn't designed. And though I'm going to get more into this in my presentation here, I'll just go briefly over like why we might think this is right. The basic idea is that, again, it seems like there's similar possibilities on either side, right? It looks like, if you have a universe that was designed, you might have the same universe that was not designed. And also neither hypothesis, one that says it was just designed and one that says it was not designed, these are very uninformative, very, they don't predict much, if anything, really at all about what sort of universes there would be, right? Or so I'm going to contend. I expect some pushback on that claim. But that's the basic idea, right? You have these very uninformative theses. They don't really say which sort of designer there would be on the design case. And they don't really say what sort of universe there would be in either case. And so I would think that there's a kind of similar probability distribution or measure across the possibility space of the sort of possible universes for both of the hypotheses. I'm not going to say more on that now, but I will come back to that. But before coming back to the main stuff regarding that, I'm going to cover 5 other objections, and I'll try to do this quickly. I don't know how much time I've used already, but I don't want to ramble too much. The first thing is, if someone rejects premise 1 and says, yeah, I think that a design here is much more probable antecedently than non-design, again, for reasons I sort of briefly laid out, this doesn't seem very reasonable to me. And even if it is right, or someone has these sort of credences or probability assignments, if my argument is otherwise correct, it's going to follow that L doesn't raise the probability of D relative to N, right? In the sense that, the fact that D is more likely given L would merely be a function of the priors, not the base factor. And you could just show that, probabilistically. I don't want to get into that, but so really my case is primarily on the second constraint. If the first premise is rejected, I don't think that's fair, but that my argument otherwise goes through and seriously undercuts the inference from fine-tuning to design. So I'll skip over some other stuff I was going to say on that. All right, so then the main thing is going to be, design, even the bare design hypothesis does more strongly predict L, and this might be argued in several ways. I'm going to cover 2 quickly here, and then the main one is I'm going to say for objection 6. The second one. Objection 2 and 3 and 6 all sort of cover this, but so one objection you might say, well, hang on, design is conceptually loaded in this way a bit, so that it's at least moderately expected on design that a designer would be that would create a universe that's life permitting, right? So even bare design, as a matter of conceptual truths about what design means, does more strongly predict life permitting conditions than the non-design hypothesis. I don't find this plausible. Again, the design hypothesis that I gave just doesn't really say anything about what sort of designer there would be or what sort of universe it would create. And as such, I seem to think that no, why would it be biased towards any sort of possible universe over any other? So I'm inclined to reject that. However, even if this worry is correct, maybe the notion of design is loaded in this way. I think that my argument could replace the term design with something even weaker, say cause or non-causally explain, or even correlate with, and I would run the same argument. Now, that argument would then require a much stronger constraint on the priors, right? It would, if this is right, if these modified arguments are sort of fair, then it will have turned out that the constraint on the original argument, constraint 1, was exceedingly generous to design. But again, I'm not gonna go into this further unless it comes up later, or someone wants to ask for more clarity on this sort of approach. On another approach, it might be argued that we have evidence such that the probability of L given design and that evidence is higher than the probability of L given n. And I'm just going to cover this in objection 3, right? On this objection, we have data given which the probability of L given design is higher. Now, this claim could be understood in 2 ways, it seems to me. One, it's a sort of general claim about the background possibility space, right? So we have reason to think that just across modal space, most of the, or more of the designers exist that create worlds that are life permitting. And this is just something about the background modal space. So I think if that's the way it's being understood, if that's the way this objection is supported, well, first of all, I think that just turns back into objection 2, and I don't think it's plausible. It seems to me that no, why would there be more designers across modal space that would create life permitting universes relative to the frequency of life permitting universes on non-design? Again, it just seems to me that you can have just as many designers that are creating all the same universes that might exist otherwise undesigned. Again, we could cover more of that later. But if the latter, suppose we observe, say, that most designers that or agents that we observe have certain features or tend to want to design certain things. People like to create other life. People like to make things that are have certain features that you might associate at least somewhat with a life permitting universe that would be absent if there were, everything collapsed in an instant or exploded apart and there was no complex chemistry or anything of interest. Now, on this approach, well, actually, this approach just fails immediately because the data on which we're updating involves the fact that L. And so when we update again on L, we'd be double counting the evidence. And it's still double counting even if the data is stated more generally. Even if we don't, it's not explicit in the data that we're updating on the fact that, humans and other life forms that we've observed have those features. It still infects the prior in the problematic way. Once again, I'll keep saying this a lot, but it's something I can go into more if necessary. But anyway, I don't expect this to be a point of contention, but I can cover this if it comes up. All right. This is a sort of common objection to replies to fine-tuning, and I think it's a reasonable sort of way to check whether, an objection is kind of proves too much, right? So I know Luke Barnes has this case where imagine the stars in the night sky, night after night, they write out the verses from the Gospel of John. Now, clearly that would give some maybe very strong support for design, or at least some sort of powerful agent capable of doing that. And if so, that should be a given, right? That would serve as evidence for that. But if some objection to fine tuning similarly applies to that case, in the sense that it rules out that would be evidence for design or at least some powerful agent, then the objection to fine tuning must go wrong, right? Because it can't be that it undermines this evidence, because that would be evidence. So then the question is, does my objection here, does the argument that I'm raising undermine that sort of inference? Right? In other words, would the reasoning I'm employing equally apply to the star writing case, such that we would infer, no, that's not any evidence for a design or a powerful agent? And the answer is yes, sort of, but in an appropriate way. So it would still be evidence, but only because there's more data on which we can update that would, given which it is strong evidence. We have data that we can update on about how complex linguistic displays like that are generally produced, especially when they're in a known language and when they correlate with similar linguistic displays, like it's correlated with text in the Bible. We know that almost certainly that's the result of some sort of agent that was capable and intended to do that. Maybe it's possible that it wasn't, but we have reason to think that based on inductive evidence and sort of how those things tend to come about, that it was the result of that. And we could also update on facts concerning what agents tend to do versus non-agents tend to do. and such that the probability that that sort of writing given agency is much greater than the probability of writing given non-agency. Note that the second inference there doesn't run into the problem that I briefly discussed in the previous objection, since it's not a problem in this case that L is included in the prior or infects the prior in that way, because we're not then updating on L, we're updating on the fact that the star writing and the inference is perfectly legitimate here. Again, I'm just kind of cutting this a bit short, but hopefully that gives some idea. Anyway, my response, thus, if we didn't have any of this other data, my response would apply to this case, I think. Why would we infer that that's more likely, so that design or a powerful agent is more likely given, how the stars are arranged? It seems, I would think that everything's sort of on the table there. But since we do have evidence about how those sort of things get produced, and we have evidence about how the sort of things designers versus non-designers tend to do, that would give us powerful evidence in favor of an agent, at least, being responsible for that. So I think that my response does sort of narrowly undermine this star writing case, but is nevertheless compatible, I think, in the right way without being strong evidence for design, or at least agency behind it. And my response leaves open that there is data which similarly points to design, right? If there were facts about the universe like star writing or something else, maybe that we think actually is the case, that is strongly correlated with design, or with a agent being behind it, then we could maybe have a good inference along those lines. But it doesn't seem to me that the facts about the parameters, the constants of nature, are something of that sort. Anyway, so that's that. So yeah, here's another objection that I received. I forget. Somebody responded to me on Twitter making this point. But anyway, the idea is that, wait, if my objection is right, doesn't that require that the rational prior on theism is like absurdly low, like approximately zero, like maybe 10 to the minus 100 plus? How absurd is that? Certainly no open-minded agnostic would have a prior like that. Or it seems weird to attribute to people for centuries, millennia indeed, belief in something with a prior that's on the order of 10 to the minus 100 plus. This sort of worry is, I think, just confused, because we have to be careful about what sort of prior we're considering here, and what sort of evidence or updating has gone into the people in consideration. So when someone is an open-minded agnostic, their credence is not merely informed, or shouldn't really be informed, by some prior on theism given like nothing about what the world is like, right? Of course, they've updated on many things. Their beliefs have been influenced in a variety of ways. What sort of rational credence they should have, that's a question I'm not going to cover here, but I think it should be much higher than what I would attribute to a rational prior on theism given these considerations. And indeed, we have all sorts of beliefs, and people have had beliefs for millennia that have, or that I think everyone would agree, for the sort of prior in consideration would be 10 to the minus 100 plus, but that's not a problem, because we have evidence sufficient to overcome those priors, and have long had evidence sufficient to overcome them. So yeah, again, I could talk about this more, but this sort of objection, I think, is just confused. All right. To be honest, the objections that I've covered so far, I've really been throat clearing to get to the stuff that I think is like actually serious. Maybe some people think that the stuff I've said before is incorrect, or maybe those objections are more serious than I think. But anyway, the stuff that I assume to be the main contention is what's in objection 6. So the basic idea is this. Hang on. My premise 2 is false. My second constraint is false, because there are some design hypotheses which we could label as D and Q, right? It's like, bare design with certain other assumptions built in, maybe. They're quite simple, and since simplicity is at least one consideration that counts in favor of prior probability, they're not antecedently very unlikely, right? Some of these, like perfect being theism, but maybe many other sorts of design, have relatively, at least not super low priors, and also more decently predict life-permitting conditions. And so if this is right, then the probability that L given D is not very low. Indeed, it might, that should say N given D, but whatever. Perhaps much higher than, sorry, L given N, it should say, not L given D. And that's the basic way this objection goes, right? If you look at the possibility space for design hypotheses, these relatively simpler ones should comprise a much larger portion of that space, or at least a moderately larger portion of that space. And many of those more strongly predict L. And so design as a whole, D as a whole, more strongly predicts L. Hopefully that's clear enough. I didn't include any diagrams, or maybe that would have been helpful to kind of get across how the objection would go.
Yeah, I mean, just for the audience, if I could say something to maybe clarify that a little bit, because full honesty, this is what I immediately went to when I read your blog post. I was like, this seems to be my worry, or at least one worry that I might have. And that's not to say that there aren't ways of responding, but I guess the thought is like, we can break D up into different, more specific hypotheses, and maybe one way to do that is like, well, there's a designer and it's perfect. And then another way to break it up is to say there's a designer and it's not perfect. And these are kind of like mutually exclusive and exhaustive for the D portion of the probability space. And we might think that there's a designer and it's perfect maybe takes up a lot of that probability space. Because maybe perfect designer is much simpler than imperfect designers, and perhaps even the whole disjunction of the various ways there might be imperfect designers. And moreover, if we are granting, as you seem to be doing at the beginning, that a perfect designer at least somewhat moderately predicts the data, then given that D and P, that there's a perfect designer, takes up at least a non-trivial portion of the design probability space, and moreover, given that it decently well predicts the data, it's actually going to turn out that even under the bare D hypothesis, the design hypothesis, L is going to have a decent probability of obtaining, and much more so than say 10 to the negative 140 or whatever. So that's just for the audience. If it makes sense, we can break up the hypothesis. We say that a perfect designers take up actually much more of that space than the various imperfect design hypotheses, and the perfect designers actually decently well predict the data. And so as a result, D, the whole space as a whole, likewise decently well predicts the data. If that's roughly what you're getting at, Troy, for the objection.
Yeah, exactly. That's helpful. Yeah, and indeed the portion of the space of D that say perfect being theism has to comprise, so long as it relatively moderately predicts life-permitting conditions, it could be still very small. It could still be, you could still say it's 1 in a billion, 1 in a trillion, 1 in 10 to the 10, whatever. Well, I guess that's not much different than 1 in a billion, but whatever. So long as it's not so low that we're approaching, the likelihood of life-permitting conditions given non-design, the argument can still go through, and the space could still be sufficiently biased in this way towards L, such so that the probability of elegant design is rather, well, maybe not even high, but not so low that the argument doesn't go through. So I'm going to explain why I don't think this is a good way to think about this, but I just want to make a couple of brief remarks at the outset. I don't think that there's going to be some sort of decisive method for generating priors or resolving disagreements about priors. I don't think there's some objectively correct way to do that, or an objectively correct prior for some case. Nevertheless, I think we can, go over some, shared principles of probability and heuristics, and go over some particular examples that will, I think, be better explained and better support my approach here than alternatives. But I'll get to that. So the first thing about simplicity, I'm sure both Matthew and Joe are well aware that in the literature, not just from Swinburne, but from many other people, there have been a variety of different ways to understand simplicity, and also ways to understand how simplicity relates to intrinsic or prior probability. I'm not going to get, I don't think we can have a fully sort of a discussion here which can do that topic justice. Nevertheless, I'm going to give some concerns for thinking about simplicity and priors in the way that the objection that I just gave would require thinking about them. So I mean, one way of thinking about simplicity is in terms of the number of entities or types of entities posited by the theory, or the number of maybe fundamental entities or types of fundamental entities, or perhaps in the number or types of like properties or fundamental properties, or some combination of these. You might think that, well, whatever. Any one of those, I think, is going to be not workable as an approach to priors. Why is that? So I list out three sort of reasons here. First, the way that I stated that is not the sense of simplicity is not sensitive to complexity in the implicit ontology. So if we're just looking at the simplicity of the ontology explicitly stated in the theory, right? Well, that might miss out on further complexity in the other things posited by the theory, but not explicitly posited. Like, it's just a consequence of the theory that those things exist. Okay, but wait a minute. What if we accommodate that? We're just thinking about the simplicity or complexity of a theory in terms of anything that would exist given the theory. Well, that's not enough either, because a theory just is not merely the list of the things that exist on the theory. It's going to give you some strong or like non-extreme expectations of other things existing. And if our sense of simplicity as it relates to priors is entirely insensitive to those other expectations, well, something's gone wrong. I think we should have a sense of simplicity that covers not just the things explicitly posited by the theory, but other things that are somewhat expected on the theory, but maybe not entailed by it. And it's also one way to maybe approach this with approach the issue with that in mind is, well, what if we just count, say, like the worlds that are compatible with the theory versus the worlds that are not compatible with the theory? And the more that are compatible with the theory, the higher the intrinsic prior probability is. That is a little bit closer to what I would want to do, although it's still a bit short-sighted because it wouldn't sufficiently penalize worlds with a more concentrated probability mass. So you might think a theory that has a sort of flat prior across a whole space, ignoring worries about space being infinite for now, would be just as antecedently likely was the one which maybe had a very low probability for most of the space, but then like a high probability for a small range of the space. That should have a lower prior than the other, I think. But the just world counting approach does not accommodate that fact. So, okay, how would I prefer to go about thinking about priors with the stuff that I've mentioned here in mind? I want to think about the simplicity of a theory. Well, maybe it's not even really rightly counted as approach to simplicity. It's just an approach to priors here. I want to think about a theory as having or giving you some sort of probability distribution over the background possibility space. And the sort of closer that distribution is to the distribution for like the null theory. The theory just says like, it's entirely uninformative, or just says like the actual world is somewhere in the background possibility.
Yeah, or it's just the conjunction of all the tautologies or something.
Yeah, something like that. So you might think that, okay, that might be like a sort of flat distribution across all the whole possibility space. The more the distribution you get for your theory in question is different from that, the more extreme, the more sort of surprising that distribution is given the background theory, null theory, what I call it, the less antecedently likely it should be. Now, okay, a couple things to note about this. One is, this is a gross idealization. I'm just thinking about this as a kind of general heuristic for approaching priors, and especially relative priors. I don't think there's going to be some, correct way to think about closeness in some rigorous sense. Now, there are, as a matter of fact, ways to model the closeness of one distribution to another. So I mentioned on the slide here, KL divergence, which is Kullback-Leibler divergence. It basically measures, it is sort of that sort of measure. It measures how different, well, it's not a measure per se, but whatever, how different one distribution is from another in the way that I briefly suggested there. And it gives you values from 0 to infinity, 0 if the distributions are the same. And then you could have some method for turning those values into prior probabilities it'd be some sort of normalized, inversed, whatever. I'm not proposing some formula for doing this, but it's kind of a rough sketch of the kind of thing that makes sense to me as a rough heuristic. And I think if you can look at theories and compare the distributions they give you in this way, that's one, I think, a very good approach to thinking about the prior, at least relative prior probabilities of those theories. Yeah, there's a lot more to say here. Maybe that can come up more in discussion. But and especially, I guess I gave a couple of objections for thinking of simplicity or priors in terms of just like the simplicity of the thing or things posited by the theory. And this is one approach. Actually, I think this is sort of the natural end to an approach which resolves those issues. Maybe it's not the only way. And maybe someone thinks that those issues aren't really issues and we should not try to go some other way. But anyway, that could be saved for further discussion. So I don't think I have that many slides left, but this is one of the, this argument here. So I'm sort of making another argument here, but it's another argument for thinking that my approach here is roughly correct, especially as it relates to the constraints in the argument. And so this is a reason for thinking that the assumptions of the original fine-tuning argument lead to some absurd conclusions. So let me just go through this. This is sort of an important point. So first, suppose that the fine-tuning argument is sound, and so the probability of D given L is much greater than the probability of N given L. Maybe many orders of magnitude, but at least much greater. I want to let M stand for a statement of the actual parameters or constants. So, if the cosmological constant is whatever it is, I don't remember, then M is going to include a description of that, and so on for all the other things. Okay. Now, suppose we first updated it according to the fine-tuning argument, we get probably D given L is much greater than probably N given L. Well, what happens when we now update on M? Right. This is just going to be a further description of what the laws and parameters are like, the specific parameters that there are. This isn't going to, it's still going to be the case that after we update on this, that the probability of design is much greater than the probability of non-design. Indeed, it might even be more favoring design for other reasons. You might think that the exact values of the parameters take support design because of issues regarding discoverability and various harmony arguments that otherwise aren't supported merely by the fact that there's life-permitting conditions, right? But in any case, the probability of D given L and M is much greater than the probability of N given L and M. And since M entails L, and the given values and constants are life-permitting, we can equally write that the probability of D given M is much greater than the probability of N given M. All of this should be perfectly acceptable to a proponent of the fine-tuning argument. What is the problem, though? Well, from those conditional probabilities, just given the way conditional probabilities are defined, we can write that the probability of D given M is equal to the probability of D and M divided by the probability of M. That's the prior D and M. And the probability of N given M is equal to the probability of N and M divided by the probability of M. Since those are on the right side of each of those equations, those are formulas that have the same denominator. We can, and given the probability of D given M is much greater than the probability of N given M, we can thereby conclude that the probability of D and M is much greater than the probability of N and M. That is to say, the prior probability of D and M is much greater than the prior probability of N and M. And this, I think, is a sort of intuitive way to see why this would have to be the case is that, in other words, just without thinking about it too mathematically, well, we already showed that the posterior after updating on M, if we're considering the hypothesis D and M versus the hypothesis N and M, we know that once we update on M, that D and M is much more likely, right? Given the further argument. But both of them entail M, and both of them entail L as well. So we update on L and we update on D. The conditional probability of L given that hypothesis is 1. So the fact that in posterior, the design hypothesis is much more likely has to come from the priors. It's not coming from the conditional probability. It must come from the prior on that hypothesis. And so it must be that the prior on DNM is much greater than the prior on NNM. This, I think, is certainly the wrong result. Why is that? Think about it this way. We're comparing now one theory which says there's a universe with, we list out all the parameters. I'm going to save time and not actually list them out. And it was designed. We have to say that hypothesis, antecedent, before looking at any of the data about what the universe is like, is orders of magnitude more likely than the hypothesis which agrees on all the details about the universe is like and says that it was not designed, right? Frankly, that's absurd, I think. I would think, at least when it comes to me, well, I mean, we're looking at very similar hypotheses. Just adding a further cause at the beginning which designed it, why would that make it orders of magnitude more likely antecedently? I don't see any reason to think that. And frankly, it's sort of a non-negotiable to me when thinking about how I'm assigning my priors that the design one is not orders of magnitude more likely. In fact, I would think it's less likely antecedently on the way I would approach it, let alone more or orders of magnitude more likely. I just want to give a quick analogy to hopefully maybe intuition pump this if it's not clear. Suppose someone came up with a cosmological model, right, according to which the universe exists, more or less as we take it, by our best physics, and it's uncaused, right? Now, someone comes up to them and says, look, I have a way better theory than that. It agrees entirely on what the universe is like, right? You got the basic cosmology right, but it includes this cause. It's this new sort of particle that I'm theorizing that's, moderately disposed to create a universe like that. So in my theory, there's this sort of particle with those sort of dispositions, and it realized them in a way to create the universe that you described on your theory. My theory is way better than yours because it's antecedently orders of magnitude more likely than yours. If this sounds absurd to you, then I think we're in agreement. If someone came up to a physicist and a cosmologist and said this, I think they would be lightly laughed out of the room. But this is not just analogous. This, I think, is exactly what the proponent of fine-tuning argument has to say in the case of the designer. There's no difference. The cases are exactly parallel. And indeed, if I just replaced particle and cause with, God and designer or whatever designed, it's the same result. Now, that seems to me like a sort of decisive case. Now, I don't know what further to say to someone who just bites the bullet and says, no, I do assign a prior to the design hypothesis, that was under consideration here, that is just orders of magnitude more likely than, there's orders of magnitude higher than the one they assigned to the non-design one. That way of approaching the probabilities here is radically different to the way I would do it. Probably, I think most people would agree with my approach, but I don't suppose that there's some sort of objective way or decisive way to resolve a dispute of that sort. So at the end of the day, that's how I would sort of leave my point there. Now, at this point, people might be thinking, wait, this sounds like I'm sort of getting at, okay, so these are the stalking horses. Sorry, I just included the AI picture of horses as corn, because there's corn stalks and stalking horses, and yeah. So this was an idea raised by it was an objection to fine-tuning arguments raised by, as far as I know, the name was from Alex Malpass, and the idea was originally from Alex Malpass. Maybe there's some earlier rendition of this that I'm unaware of, but that's the source anyway, as far as I know. The basic idea is this: look, okay, design doesn't strongly predict L, but more substantive design hypotheses, say D and Q, do more strongly predict L. But in the same way, right, there maybe N doesn't strongly predict L, but more substantive non-design hypotheses, say N and R, more strongly predict L. And, slightly more precisely, we could say for any design hypothesis D and Q, there are some non-design hypothesis N and R such that the probability of D and Q is less than or equal to the probability of N and R. And so it's a constraint on the priors, and the probability of L given D and Q is less than or equal to the probability of N and R, L given N and R. And just from those two in Bayes' rule, we just get that the probability of D and Q given L is less than or equal to the probability of N given L and R. That would be posterior. And if this is right, then this supports the probability assignments of my approach. But why I think this is right? So there's multiple ways to motivate the stalking horse point. So the way that I did it in the blog post in question, I didn't go into too much detail, but the basic idea was this: like, suppose that the given design hypothesis D and Q predicts L with some probability C. Well, for any such hypothesis, I could construct a hypothesis that says that N is true and L obtains with probability C. I think arguably that's not antecedently less likely than the D and Q, and by construction, it equally predicts the data that L. There's another slightly more complicated motivation that I put here that I don't know if I want to.
Yeah, let's skip that.
Here's another objection I considered. Well, there's also objections that I didn't write down that someone might make specifically to the stalking horse thing.
Yeah, let's go through this one, and then we'll turn over to Matthew. Because what if Matthew makes the other ones? Then you can just
true. What if someone says, okay, I sort of implied, I don't know if I stated explicitly, that the right way to think about the distribution for the null theory was as sort of like flat across the possibility space. But maybe that's the wrong way to think about the distribution. Maybe it should be somewhat biased towards, simpler worlds, right? It's worlds with fewer fundamental entities or fewer types of fundamental, whatever, something like that. And if that's right, then don't we get the same result as before when I raised objection 6, that the space of design hypotheses is going to be somewhat biased towards L, and possibly we don't get the same thing on non-design. Actually, well, the thing that I have on the second part of the previous slide is part of a response to this. But the short answer is that actually my view could accommodate this, right? Let's suppose that the right way to think about the distribution for the prior and the null, theory is somewhat biased towards simpler theories. Well, we're still going to get that when we think of since we're having a distribution over worlds here, when we think of the simpler worlds, you're going to have some design theories are going to be simpler than other ones. Okay. However, for any given design theory, right, there's going to be a simpler theory that excludes that designer. And so if the space is biased towards simpler theories, well, you're going to have more probability mass assigned to those which are the same but exclude the designer. And so even if you get, maybe, I'm sorry if this isn't a very clear explanation, but the point is that even if you get sort of non-trivial or non-uniform distribution across the space of possibilities at which there's a designer, you're going to get something similar across the other space where there's even the likelihood is at least as high for the non-designer version, if that makes sense. Probably I'll have to explain this more if this comes up, but that's a brief point there. And that's the way in which it's compatible with my approach. That was supposed to say chance, not change. One more objection. Sometimes the way the fine-tuning algorithm is run is, well, okay, either it's a matter of necessity, chance, or design. And and Bill Craig will say things like, well, it's not the result of chance or necessity, so it's design. But if I'm saying on my approach, then what is the answer? Right, I'm not saying it's necessity. Well, I'm not saying that it's not design or it is design. I'm just saying that the argument isn't very good in favor of design. Well, in the case where it isn't design, what would it be then? Would it be? Yeah. Would it be chance? Well, it depends on how chance is understood. So, if by chance we mean the result of some sort of chancy process, then, well, maybe, but maybe not. We don't have to suppose that whether the universal life reading is a result of a chancy process given non-design. It could be, but it's not part of the hypothesis or entailed by it. is a chance in the sense that, well, there's maybe, at least on the theory, no further explanation for why it's this way rather than other ways that it could have been. Yeah, that's true. But I don't see any problem with that. There's going to be a lot of contingent facts about the world that are like that. Like there's some way, and then when they could have been some other way, and there's ultimately no further explanation for why they're that way. Although I don't want to turn this into an explanation about a discussion about explanation and sufficient reason and whatever. And that's it. Yeah, the main point is that just certain design hypotheses may more strongly predict L, even ones that in certain respects are kind of simple, like perfect being theism, but they do so at a cost to their prior, such that the posterior on that design hypothesis is not greater than that on at least the bare non-design hypothesis. So yeah, that'll be. Sorry, I went way too long. I don't know if you want to cut that down. You might cut out certain parts.
It's all right. So we'll turn it over to Matthew, and Matthew, you'll have, go as long as you want, like 20, 30 minutes if you want. But yeah.
But okay. Yeah. So thanks for that, Troy. So I have a few worries about the argument. I'm a little bit doubtful about premise 1, but I guess that won't be the main one I discuss, because I basically agree that that's not actually where most of the meat of the argument lies. And if you buy it, that if you think premise 1 is false, then the main heavy lifting would be based on priors. The main thing I think is wrong is premise 2. And so I think really that's the crux of the debate. So, first of all, and I'll revisit this later, but I find the example that I gave where the initial conditions of the universe spell out made by God to be a pretty convincing one, where I think, if it spelled out made by God, that would be good evidence for the existence of God. Now, you could similarly say, well, look, why is it more likely that you'd have a designer who makes it spell out made by God than that it would just spell out made by God? Why is a designer doing X likelier than X just happening? Now, your reply was, well, we have this kind of inductive track record where most of the time when we see written language, there was some agent who does it, and you think that's the only reason we infer that. I don't think this is correct. So imagine that we were a species incapable of language, where we had spoken language, but we never wrote anything down. There was just no written language throughout the entire history of the species. Now imagine that scientists probed the initial conditions of the universe, and they found it was just, this vast sequence of symbols. And when they did these high-quality linguistic analysis on it, of the sort that linguists actually do to figure out languages, they found that it corresponds precisely to a human language. And in fact, it spells out this, 1,000-page, if you convert it into language in some non-ad hoc way, it spells out this 1,000-page method describing in excruciating detail a series of facts, like the truth of the anthropic argument, maybe. It's very detailed. I think in this case, we would obviously say, yes, it has a designer of some sort, even though we would not be using induction from other language. The second point I would make about this is, I think in cases where you're making some inductive track record argument, there's going to be some Bayesian way of making the argument from the priors in a way that I think is doubtful about this argument. It's troubling if you can't make an argument in Bayesian terms, and so basically you have to make it only as an inductive argument. I feel like there's something I feel like I don't know exactly how to make that kind of intuition precise, but I feel like something's going wrong. But I think that's sort of less decisive than the other things that I'm going to say. And then lastly, regarding this, you say that the reason why we infer agency is that the probability of an agency given some item of writing is high, at least in our present observations. But I would say, look, you can make a similar inductive argument where you can say, in our observations, if we observe that there's something that's plausibly valuable and that's super, super improbable, then we normally think that's written by agents. Or if we see a thing where it's a sizable portion of actually existing human agents would want the thing to exist, and the thing is super improbable, then we assume that a human did it. Which is why if you see writing on a piece of paper, you shouldn't assume that it's just a random ink mark, because it's really unlikely that the random ink mark would spell out that particular pattern. Well, it's much more likely that an agent would write that. So I think if your move in terms of making an inductive argument, I think could be parity. Second, something that's always rubbed me the wrong way about these kinds of stalking horse arguments is I think that for an argument to be successful, all that it needs to do is sort of be the kind of argument that would convince someone who's agnostic or reasonably near an agnostic. If an argument would convince someone who, if your objection is compatible with an argument convincing someone who starts with, say, a 20% credence in theism, I feel like it doesn't really disbar the force of the theistic argument. But now, consider this objection. This objection, it involves suggesting that a designer who would make fine-tuning has a really, really low prior. And so you think, basically, if a person was on the fence about God, like if they thought that there was a 20% chance that God existed, and by God I mean like a perfect being, and they thought this before they had heard about the fine-tuning argument, and then they learned about the fine-tuning argument, it's perfectly compatible with everything that you've said, that this person should then start being a super committed theist. And so then I guess I would say, if the person already thought there was a 20% credence in theism, and they think given theism, given that there was a perfect being, the odds of there being a designer aren't trivial, then it seems like it would update in favor of that hypothesis. So I think sort of even if you're right about this would maybe, I feel like it's more phrased as more thought of as an argument for why theism has a really low prior than an objection to fine-tuning, and it's compatible with it being a good argument. Okay, third, I think the fine-tuning argument establishes that the odds of fine-tuning conditional on naturalism are extremely low, and I think you've been willing to grant this, basically. And so in order for the argument to go through, it must be that the odds of an agent who would finally tune a universe conditional on there being a powerful agent, conditional on there being some foundational agent, is similarly low. If you think that an agent is equally likely to make any cosmological constant, then the odds of a finely tuned cosmological constant will be comparatively low. Then so long as we have reason to reject this claim, the argument won't go through. So long as we have reason to think that the odds that an agent would want to finally tune various parameters are not super low, then we have then the argument won't work. But I think we have at least three plausible routes to rejecting this claim and towards thinking that the odds that a foundational agent would make finely tuned life-permitting constants aren't super low. First is that I think there's something special about the cosmological constant value that gives rise to life, namely that it gives rise to life. So long as the prior probability of an agent caring about agents existing rather than chaos isn't too low, on the order of 1 in Google, then an agent is likelier to create a life-permitting cosmological constant value than some other cosmological constant value. But insofar as the odds really are that low, on the order of 1 in Google, that an agent would want to bring about conditions for an agent to exist and would have the power to do so, well, I think we need a really powerful argument for that. Like, if you claim that something starts with a probability of on the order of 1 in Google, there needs to be some really convincing reason for thinking that that's right. Second, I think, as I was saying before, an argument is successful if it would convince an agnostic. And so if someone was already agnostic before hearing fine-tuning, where they thought, the probability of a perfect being who's the sort of creature that plausibly make fine-tuning is, say, 20%, then after learning about fine-tuning, I think they would potentially be convinced. The notion that if there's a designer, it's likely God, I think is independently motivated in that, and this was sort of the route that you were talking about a little bit, which was just, I think God is a mind of the very simplest sort, a mind completely without limits, because there's no limit on his power or on his knowledge. He knows everything, he can do everything, and then he would be motivated to always pursue the good because he both knows all the moral facts, has no rational constraints, and can do whatever he wants. So this is a very simple hypothesis. I think that conditional on there being a designer of some sort, you should think the odds of there being a God, a perfect being like this, are at least not astronomically low. They're at least higher than the odds of, winning the lottery 10 times in a row or something. And that's all you need to reject the argument, right? Because if you think that the odds of there being this agent who would plausibly make fine-tuning, given that there's a designer of some sort, are not trivial, then you'd go that route. I'll discuss in a moment some of the things you said in your opening your previous statement about this. But so because the odds of fine-tuning given naturalism are so low, all we need is the conclusion that 1, the odds of the simplest kind of mind, namely God, are not super low, conditional on there being a designer, and 2, the odds of God making a finely tuned universe aren't super low. And I think both of these are quite plausible. Now, maybe, I think lots of people are kind of doubtful about some of these steps. Maybe you think minds aren't simple. Maybe you think that, consciousness isn't fundamental. It's some complicated physical thing. Maybe you're not a moral realist, so you don't think that there are any moral facts of which the king would be aware. But I think all you need is to think that these theses are not like astronomically improbable on the order of, 1 in a billion. Well, actually, even if they're all 1 in a billion, I think, the probabilities still check out. So all you need to think is that, like, the odds that moral realism is true and that minds are fundamental and that minds are like simple and irreducible are higher than the odds of, I don't know, you winning the lottery 5 times or something for this reply to go through. And then 3, even putting aside God, a pretty commonly held thesis is that the good is self-motivating. So if an agent sees something is good, they'll be motivated to bring it about, absent a conflicting desire. You don't have to think this is definite. All you need to think is that it's not astronomically unlikely. But so long as this is right, and worlds that are life-permitting are the best worlds, an agent might be motivated to bring about a life-permitting world instead of, say, one with a cosmological constant value that prohibits life. And note, because the odds of a life-permitting universe are so low on naturalism, we just need some story of why a designer might make a life-permitting universe to finally tune the constants to favor the design hypothesis. Once again, all we need is that the probability is not super astronomically low. And so, it doesn't strike me as that improbable that if there was holding our law structure in the background, if there was a designer who was, who existed of some sort, that it's more likely that they would make the cosmological constant that we have, which happens to be the one that gives rise to life, rather than one of the, some random of the Googleplex times more cosmological constants that wouldn't give rise to life or anything of value. It doesn't seem astronomically unlikely that if there was a foundational agent, it would care about life. In addition, I think we can see that Troy's thesis is wrong, because it would imply that a designer who cares about life would be no likelier than a designer who cares about like marbles or making more than 10 quadrillion bits of cheese, where it would say that in terms of the prior of these beings, you should have a flat prior across them. I don't think that's right. I also worry that Troy's view would disbar any case where one infers that any agent designed anything. Right, so imagine, in the sky there appeared these just like massive spaceships firing down laser beams that like blew up continents or something. I think we would probably think that was aliens. But on Troy's view, I worry that you could say, well, why is the odds of there being these things higher than the higher than the odds of the ships? Why would the odds of agents making these ships be higher than the odds of the ships just existing? So you talked a little bit about the concerns about the designer being simple. So I think that I think we should all agree that simplicity is a virtue of some sort. Otherwise, it's hard to rule out all sorts of bizarre theories like that. I don't know, a tiger will appear in my room 1 second from now. Now you agree that like. It sounds like you thought sort of the most promising reply to this is to go the simplicity route, to suggest, look, a perfect being is sort of simple, and so it doesn't just have the same probability as a really complicated designer. But then you had sort of doubts about whether simplicity of the sort that would make a being like this simple really is a virtue. So whether it's about the number of fundamental entities. So there are complicated issues surrounding that. But I think we should all have some amount of uncertainty, like meta uncertainty regarding what the right way is of divvying up priors. And so long as you think, look, so long as you think there's a 1 in a billion chance that basically the sizable contingent of philosophers who think that simplicity is about something like the description length of a fundamental entity or the sort of number and kinds of entities. I think if you start with a non-trivial credence in the right way of divvying up priors being this way, and then given that theory, you think the prior in there being a designer of the sort who would want to make life is on the order of 1 in 10 to the 40th, then I think you'll kind of get a high probability of light theism given fine tuning. Now, Troyer seemed to suggest that simplicity is kind of about how much different theories rule out. So you kind of have flat prior across worlds, and then a theory takes a hit if it rules out more potential ways that the world might be. I don't agree with this. So the theory that basically the laws will continue working as they have before is much less modest than the theory that the laws will break down in some chaotic way 1 second from now. There are way more ways for the laws to break down chaotically 1 second from now than for them to remain the same way. Nonetheless, I'm really confident that the laws will continue working the same way. So I think you'll have to think that just like a simpler worlds are inherently likelier. So to Troyer, he was trying to get to the core intuition behind the argument, and it's like, why would just thinking that a designer who made X, why would that just be like astronomically orders of magnitude likelier than just thinking that there is X without a designer? Like, now, when he was saying this, I had the opposite reaction. I feel like there are lots and lots of cases where we do this all the time, right? So, in a case where we observe some ink spill on a paper, where we observe writing on a paper, we all say it's likelier that a designer did it. And it's not just a little bit likelier. It's like many orders of magnitude likelier that some agent made the design than they didn't. Why do we do this? Well, it seems like we do it because the odds of that happening by chance are really, really low. And we can glimpse a reason why an agent might do that. And it doesn't even have to be that we think it's super likely that an agent would do it, right? So, if I saw in front of Joe, a piece of paper that had some crude drawing, I would think, my prior in Joe making a crude drawing is not very high, right? Joe's a sort of sophisticated and serious guy, many published, just really, the ideal man. But so I think my prior in Joe making a crude drawing would be fairly low. But nonetheless, I would be really confident that he made the crude drawing rather than it being produced by a random ink spill, because the probability is considerably higher. And so then if we observe that there's something, the constants are such that we could glimpse a reason why an agent might reasonably want to set them that way, but the odds that they would exist if an agent didn't set them are very low, on the order of 1 in Google, on the order of throwing a dart across the known universe and hitting a particular atom. It just seems obvious that we should think it's way more likely that a designer did that than that it happened by chance. There's more to be said, of course, but those are sort of my basic thoughts on the matter. So happy to discuss more.
Awesome. Okay, so for the remainder of the discussion, maybe about 45-ish minutes or something like that, 40 maybe, to give me 5 minutes to end it. Let's begin with Troy. Just pick one issue that he brought up, and then we'll try to go through some of them.
I don't know. We could start from the top. The first thing I wrote down was about the star writing case. So, you said that on my response, the only reason we have for thinking that this is the result of design or agency is like some inductive track record about how these things tend to be produced, something like that. Although I did add that we would have two sorts of lines of evidence, right? One regarding that inductive track record, but also regarding what agents tend to be like or tend to do. And that can apply even if no agent we know of has ever written something down. So I think we would still have good evidence about what agents, in support of agents doing that sort of thing, even if we didn't have any example of someone having written down in that way. I think it would be weaker, but it would still potentially be good.
So I think we can parody with that with fine-tuning, where we say, look, we know something about what agents do, which is that sometimes they bring about life. Sometimes they're motivated to do that. And so... Yeah,
but I covered that, though.
Yeah, well, so you accuse that of being double counting. I don't think that would be double counting, right? So imagine if you have some experiences that inform you about what some class of entities is like, it's not double counting for you to then use that to look at the prior, that entity is of that class would bring about the thing. So as an example, I had some example involving a witch that I'm trying to remember. Okay, so let's imagine that you have these entities called witches, where basically like witches, they have magic abilities, and they're very devious. They basically possess all the vices to the maximal extent that one can. And so there's sort of an open question about like, okay, what things would a being that possesses all the vices to the maximum extent, what things would they bring with that? To what extent would they prioritize malevolence versus dishonesty versus all sorts of other vices? And then suppose that you see some scheme that involved just a vast display of dishonesty, just to an utterly astounding degree, that actually seemed to prioritize dishonesty over malevolence. But the scheme was needed for witches to be created in the first place. So for the witches that you observe, this scheme was a requirement for you to get those witches. I'd say in that case, it would be perfectly reasonable to say, look, what our experience with witches tell us is that witches, those who possess these vices, tend to prioritize dishonesty over malevolence. And so then we say, well, so it's more likely that a witch made the universe, that a creature who would prioritize dishonesty over malevolence made the universe. And so I think you can make a similar move with agents. You say, look, we sort of learn something conceptually about what agents are typically like.
Yeah, so hang on. If we're learning something, if it's a conceptual fact, right, then it's nothing to do with what we've observed about how agents behave. It's some fact about what it means to be a designer or an agent, right? Or are you saying that we're updating on facts about what agents are doing or have done? Because I covered both of these. I don't know. We could go into that again, or
so it's not a conceptual fact. It's not true it does not obtain merely by definition.
Right.
It's that what obtains merely by definition is that witches are by definition beings that are motivated by all the vices. So basically, whatever the worst traits that could motivate a person is, those traits are the ones the witches possess. Mm-hmm. After learning those things about what witches are like, I think you could use that to inform what another witch-like being would do in terms of bringing about the creation of witches. Where you say, look, from the behavior of actual witches, we learn that basically beings who possess maximal vice are likely to be very dishonest. And so once we learn,
then the empirical stuff about what witches actually do just is irrelevant. Then, right? It's by the definition that they are disposed to act on vices or whatever.
No. So what is the definition is that they're motivated to act on vices. What you discover from your experience with witches is that these creatures, these witches who are disposed to act on vices, prioritize dishonesty to a great extent, and to a shocking extent. Like Brian B. Sung, they recognize that lying is just the worst thing in the world. You shouldn't do it to prevent an infinite amount of torture, and so they just go out and lie all the time. I think if you saw, look, these are creatures that are motivated by whatever the opposite of the good is, and they're just very, very dishonest, more dishonest than you would have expected. Then if there's some really dishonest scheme, which was a prerequisite for the creation of witches in the first place, then your credence in it being responsible, in the being responsible for it, being some being with maximally malicious motivations, should go up. Because basically, you learn something about what maximally malicious beings are like, and then that informs, you learn that by discovering what actual witches tend to be like, and then that informs your theory about what the mere maximally evil being about the sort of the contents of the mere maximally evil being hypothesis.
Sorry, we have the hypothesis that there's a maximally evil being that. The existence of these things supports a maximally evil creator hypothesis or something.
Sorry, I shouldn't. So it doesn't have to be a specifically maximally evil being. It's just
a very evil being.
Yeah, just one of the range of possible very evil beings. One of the range of possible fiends, devils, etc.
Yeah. Okay. I'm not sure. I mean, I'd have to see the structure of the inference, but the inference that I was describing, it just plainly is double counting. So, if we had, I could give an analogy if you want, that I think is exactly the same. But imagine someone finds they find a fossil in their backyard, and then they say, okay, well, this lets me know that, probably there were creatures like this that lived around here some long time ago. Okay. And then they take that information to infer, well, actually, it's not so surprising that there'd be a fossil here, given that there were these creatures that existed here a long time ago. And wait a minute, we can't update on the fact that there's a fossil here in order to infer that it's not surprising that there'd be a fossil here, right? Even if we ignore certain facts about what the fossil signifies, right?
Yeah. So I guess the thing, the kind of inference I have in mind seems more like, so you find a fossil in your backyard of a reptile, and so then you think, after doing that, you think, oh, probably it's more likely that the evolutionary process will produce reptiles than some randomly selected creature. So once you discover the thing, it informs. Once you discover some fact about specific creatures, it informs your specific judgments about what creatures in general that are produced by the biological process are like, and so then that raises your credence in any sort of, like, just, if we stumble across a random creature in the universe, that raises your credence in it being a reptile. I think similarly, if we discover that what agents in general are like, based on our experience with agents on Earth, is that they are often motivated to pursue the good, then I think it's not double counting to use that to tell us something about what kinds of motivations an agent might have.
So that in itself is fine. The problem is that the double counting comes in if we then also update on the fact that L. The problem is that the data in question entails or assumed that L in the first place. Right? So if you've already updated on that data that there's creatures that tend to do these sorts of things, then you've already assumed L in the background. And so when you then update on L again, you don't get further confirmation of the theory. That would be the double counting.
Yeah, well, so I think there are cases where you get to sort of like update on facts out of order. So what you do is, like, you look at what you imagine updating on is, you first realize the following fact about our world, which is just that most agents, or at least a sizable chunk of agents, are in fact motivated to produce the good. You could imagine an agent sort of like in a dark room being fed these pieces of information in order. Okay, so first they're fed that piece of information. And then after that, they're asked what their credence is in there being a designer who's motivated to bring about the good. So, it's not trivial. And then they learn that we have life-permitting constants. And so even though, like the order in which you do the update is not in accordance with the order in which you find out the facts, but that's perfectly fine.
Yeah, wait, so it sounds like you're getting at the other way. I briefly, in the slide, I went over this briefly, which is that if we ignore the specific data about, we have some sort of generalization that doesn't strictly entail that there are life-permitting conditions, then we're not double counting because we're not including L in our prior. The problem is we are including L in our prior. If we somehow learned that there were that designers tend to do some things in the way that you described, then that would be legitimate. The problem is that's not how we learned it. This is what makes it like the case. In other words, we are taking the specific data in the case of, like, the fossil, that we found a fossil here, inferring a more general fact from that there probably were some creatures like that around here, and then how would the update go exactly in that? And then, and it would be illegitimate to conclude from that it's not surprising that there was a fossil like that here, right? But I'm not the more general version. But it is the same, right?
But I'm not saying we start with the assumption that there are agents, and so then we update on the fact, and then we say, oh, that there are agents is not surprising on the theory. What I'm doing is I'm saying we learn some general fact about agents from our experience, and then we use that. And then we see, in light of that fact, what are the odds that an agent would do things of various sorts?
But no, the problem is the data that we use to come to that conclusion assumes or entails that L. Right?
But
and it doesn't help if you say,
that's also true. That's also true in the which case. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if, like, it can be that some fact S entails some fact S prime, and also S prime can be used to motivate the prior, to tell you about the prior of some different the prior of S given some other hypothesis.
So it's not going to. It depends, right? If the point is, if the other data is epistemically independent of what you use to update in the first place, then that's fine. The point is that in this case, it's not, and invariably you get double counting as a result.
Sorry, so can you explain what the disanalogy is supposed to be between this and the which?
So I'd have to, could you write down the which case? I'm not sure I understand all the details.
Maybe it wouldn't. Yeah, I can write it and, like, email it to you maybe after.
Yeah, Actually, I
I feel
think
like
let's move on to
maybe if we
yeah,
move to a
well, let's
different
just
point, because we're going to
let's
spend
close it
forever on
out. Yeah, we'll move
Yeah.
on to another point.
Yeah.
Troy, bring up a different point in Matthew's response that you guys can go back and forth on.
Okay, the next thing I had written down was that the argument would be successful if it would convince a sort of open-minded agnostic. And the idea was like, well, okay, an open-minded agnostic has, some non-trivial credence in theism, or, at least of the sort that you described. Maybe it's not that high, but at least it's not 10 to the negative whatever, 100 plus. And for someone like that, if they approach an argument like this, yeah, they, taking that prior into the fine-tuning argument, given the things that I already granted, they should update strongly in favor of design, and indeed in favor of that version of being theism. But that's I already covered this in my slides. The problem is that the freedoms that the open-minded agnostic brings to the table is not necessarily, and I would very strongly expect that it's not merely the sort of prior that's under consideration in these arguments. They've, again, updated on a lot more. Their beliefs have been informed by and influenced by a lot more than just the stuff that we're considering relevant to the prior. The sort of prior in question doesn't include any data, save for maybe what the general physical structures are like, right? This the general parameters, not the values, on one version of framing the argument. They're not based on really anything. Maybe we have to include a little bit more about the background possibility space or theoretical virtues or something, but nothing about the experiences they've had or what's around them or religious traditions. None of that is relevant to the prior that goes into the fine-tuning argument. So it's not a problem. Yeah, so maybe you see the point.
Yeah, so I agree that what I'm saying does not bear on, like this does not directly bear on whether any of the premises in your argument is correct, but it does bear on how we should think of it does bear on how we should think about whether your argument is a response to fine tuning, right? So I feel like it's sort of an impoverished response to fine tuning if basically what you think of as this decisive reply to fine tuning is such that if a person was on the fence and then they heard about fine tuning and heard about your objection, then they should be convinced. Now it sounded like what you said, and maybe I'm misunderstanding, but it sounded like what you said is, look, the facts that they're updating on, that the open-minded agnostic is updating on, of maybe like, I don't know, life or something, will be ones that already take into account fine-tuning. Was that?
Well,
Okay.
No, so not necessarily. I mean, so that might. And realistically, it's going to take into account facts about life and so on that I think is going to make the fine-tuning further inference not independent from that. But no, it's going to be based on a wide range of things. A person might never have heard of the fine-tuning argument. They might not be aware that the vast majority of the ways that you can have a universe are not life permitting and so on, of course. But I think even independent of that, a person is updated on a lot of things which would count in favor of theism, or at least count in favor of having a moderate prior on theism. Now, what sort of credence is rational for a sort of open-minded agnostic to have? I'm not going to have that discussion now.
But I'm just my aim is really to convince Joe. Just at the end of the day, I feel like if we want him to on the theist side. This is part one of a 39-step plan of world
domination. Set out this plan like years ago.
But I feel like if you think someone like Joe still like imagine Joe had just never heard of fine-tuning and then hears of fine-tuning, and then if on your view basically it's compatible with what you're saying, that after hearing fine-tuning and after hearing your response, he should then become a theist basically, where because your response bears on what the prior of theism should be, then I feel like it's not a successful response to fine-tuning, even if it might be a reason why it might be it's like I feel like it's not best thought of as a response to fine-tuning, as just a reason why, like, independently the prior of theism is really low.
Well, so it is a response to the fine-tuning in the sense that I think an open-minded agnostic, maybe Joe, maybe someone else, whatever, if they take my critique seriously, when they update on the data that obviously they've already updated on it, but they can imagine going through this, then they should not favor design to non-design. That's the conclusion of my argument, unless they already favor design to non-design, in which case
hold on,
made any further progress.
So an open-minded agnostic of the sort I have in mind starts with a non-trivial credence in theism, where theism is the proposition that there's a perfect being. And so what you're saying is, well, look, actually, no, their prior in theism should be really, really low, of the sort I've described, assuming theism, means it's not terribly unlikely that there would be a perfect being. But then I feel like the open-minded agnostic, even if they hadn't yet thought about fine-tuning, and then they think about fine-tuning, maybe your view is that on the right way of divvying up priors, it won't increase their credence in some bare version of the design hypothesis. But the point is, if you have someone who starts with a non-trivial credence, more than one in some astronomically low number, in their being a perfect designer, then it's consistent with what you're saying, that they should just be a theist.
No. But the problem is, you're supposing that someone comes with some credence, some non-super low credence in a designer, like a perfect being. And then when they see the fine-tuning argument, that should inform or just be their prior that they input into the argument on perfect being theism. That's the sort of thing that I've already been arguing against, right? The point is that the prior relevant to this argument is not one which is going to include all of whatever things that they've updated on, or is a matter of just the whims of whatever their current credence is.
Wait, sorry. I've heard you say that a few times, but I don't quite get the relevance. Where what you've said is the prior relevant to the prior that an open-minded agnostic should have will not be the same as just the bare prior in theism.
Of course, right? Because they've already updated.
No, I agree, but I don't. What's supposed to be the takeaway from that?
Well, the takeaway is that it's compatible with them having a moderate or even high confidence before considering the fine-tuning argument in perfect being theism or some other theistic or design hypothesis, and that they might agree that the sort of prior that I use in the constraint on the priors that I have in the argument, that's going to be a very different probability than they have in perfect being theism, but it's because of the sort of things that we're conditionalizing on in the background, is reasonable, and that design is not favored to non-design given L. That's compatible with my approach and the credence I bring to the table.
Yeah, I agree that on your I agree that if what you're saying is correct, then a person who just has a prior in theism and then considers the design hypothesis, their credence in design won't go up.
But it's also it's not just consider the bare design; they consider the more specific design hypothesis too.
Okay, so imagine a very simple agent of the function.
And also, if the bare design hypothesis doesn't go up, then trivially the more specific one, while it could go up, could not go up higher than the non-design one. That was the point.
No, I agree. Yeah. I agree. If what you're saying is correct, then a person should not. If everything you say is correct, then a person should not be a theist as a result of the fine. Their credence shouldn't be above 0.5 in theism as a result of the fine-tuning argument. Right. But what I'm saying is just okay, imagine imagine that there's someone who they don't find the problem of evil to have any force. The only argument they find convincing is they consider the prior of theism, and then they think theism, I don't know, explains pretty well the mathematical facts or something. This agent is very different from me psychologically. I don't agree with any of this, but so this agent, let's say they think in light of these considerations, there's a 1 in 1,000 chance of there being a perfect being. And the other, just to make math easier, the other, 999 out of 1,000 chance is just naturalism. But they've never heard of fine-tuning. And then they hear about fine-tuning for the first time. They hear Frank Turek, say, I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. And they're just mind blown. I think it's compatible with what you're saying, I think, that this person, their credence in theism, provided that their credence in theism prior to considering the fine-tuning data was non-trivial, was say 1 in 1,000. It's perfectly compatible with what you're saying, that this should push them to have more than 50% credence in theism. And so for that reason, I feel even if I agree, if we buy everything that you're saying, then we should our credence in theism won't overall go up. But I feel I think the better way of thinking about it is just as an argument for why theism has a ridiculously low prior, rather than as an argument for why the fine-tuning argument isn't persuasive. And I think basically when you take the hit on, yes, the update that we get in favor of a perfect being relative to bare design is consistent with all the things you say on the order of Google to 1. I feel like when you take the hit on that, you shouldn't you shouldn't treat it as some decisive reply to fine tuning. Really, what it is, I think, is just a reason why theism is independently super unlikely, and that's just like a sort of anti-prior, just like a separate argument for why theism has a really low prior. That's supposed to be so low that it cancels out the update.
When the person updates on some data, whether that is suitable to the sort of a fine-tuning update after that, in a way that's, they're not already updating on something that's entails L or makes L more likely, then they could update in favor of theism. So for example, maybe someone has some maybe someone's convinced by an ontological argument, and then or they think it's plausible, right? And so there's somewhat move towards theism, even independent of any data about what the universe is like, that might even probabilistically bear on L, right? Then that's fine, right? Where we go from there, the problem is, even if someone, as I said in my presentation, even if we have a higher prior on theism, and maybe some of these arguments do a lot of work there, like maybe ontological arguments, or I don't know, some sort of contingency argument that works sort of independently of what the universe is like, or I don't know, some sort of kind of almost a priori consideration like that, because it would have to be almost a priori in order to be sufficiently independent from the fact that L. Then they would have a higher prior on design and on theism, and when they update on the fact that L, they're going to have a higher posterior, but all the work is being done by this other evidence, if my case was correct. So I don't know, we could go back on that and more.
Sorry. Can I just address briefly one point that was made a few minutes ago that I just thought of something?
Sure.
Fine, yes.
Yeah. So sorry. So regarding the made by God versus fine tuning case, so I guess you were saying, look, the fine tuning thing is double counting because you're using your assessment about what agents are like to look at the probability of agents doing some particular task. Why isn't the made by God thing the same way? Why isn't using that to say that the odds of an agent writing out made by God?
The problem is that we're not then updating on the fact that L. We're not updating on a fact of something that would be double counting in that case. In that case, we're just updating on the fact that there are stars written in the organized in a certain way, which is not assuming or parasitic epistemically on the data that we updated in the first place, which was that design.
So you agree that it would be reasonable if the initial conditions were in this complicated pattern where they seem to be correspond to language, that right. it would be reasonable to think that a designer made them that way. But do you think it would not be reasonable to think a designer made them that way in terms of fine tuning? And right. You think that there's a way I formulated the argument, which you think was double counting. We obviously had to dispute about that. But what I'm not sure about is, what's the relevant difference between the made by God case and the fine tuning case?
Yeah, the relevant difference is that what we update on, we're updating first on facts about what designers tend to do, or how those sort of things tend to get produced, blah blah blah, whatever stuff that we've observed, and that what we've updated, that data does not assume, is not epistemically reliant on some fact about how the stars were arranged. So then when we update on the fact that the stars are arranged in a certain way, we're not double counting. Whereas in the fine tuning case, the data in question about how agents behave and how these things tend to get produced, blah blah whatever, that is updating on data that's not.
Okay, so imagine if we did some physics and what we discovered was basically that in order for, just by vast coincidence, in order for us to exist, in order for there to be conditions, arrangements of the universe that are conducive to life, it has to be that the stars spell out made by God. Would you then say that them spelling out made by God would, because now our existence is probabilistically dependent on that now we should now no longer think that it had a designer?
Sorry, in order, in this scenario in question, in order for there to be stars in the first place,
in order for us to exist,
in order for
stars arranged that way. It's similar to like how in order for us to exist, L would have to obtain. In order for us to exist, maybe, either the stars would have to be arranged that way, or maybe the initial conditions would have already had to have been like spelled out, like made by God in love or something.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
so we might imagine that the fine tuning is such that the only life-fitting parameters are ones in which, like according to them,
I wasn't imagining this being true of like the constants. I was just imagining it being true. Like imagine basically like the conditions that have to obtain in the universe for there to be life is it has to be that the pattern of stars that exists is such that it spells out this like lengthy and eloquent prose about some subject. In a case where we discovered that, would it be reasonable to think that there was a designer of that, of the lengthy and eloquent prose?
Of course, we would think that there's the reason to think there's a designer of that. But the problem is that comes. We can already infer that from the fact that we know that we exist and that our existence requires this, right? Oh, unless you're saying, oh wait, hang on, no, sorry, I'm misunderstanding the example. It just requires that they're arranged a certain way, but doesn't require that the arrangement was a result of a designer.
Yes, right.
And then you're asking, would that confirm design? Well, it doesn't. It seems to be fine, right? Even though the fact that the observations that we might make about what designers do, in some sense, requires that there's that they were arranged in this way already. It might still be epistemically independent. So,
so why can't we say fine tuning is epistemically independent?
Because the way we found out about designers doing certain things assumes that there's life. I mean,
wait, and the way we found out about designers doing things like arranging stars in various ways also assumes that there's life.
It does also assume there's life, but it doesn't assume that life requires this, that there's stars arranged.
Well, we were supposing in the hypothetical that that's the case, though, right?
Yeah, we're supposing that's the case. And as a matter of fact, as a matter of some like natural law or something. But it's not something like, oh, if we're supposing that that's something that we know, might have to think about it and write it out.
Yeah, like people sometimes I've heard, and I don't think this is correct, but what people say is that like in order for life to arise, basically we needed to have Jupiter because it like blocked off asteroids that would have otherwise covered Earth. I don't think that's correct, but like you could imagine there being some way the physical system was set up where basically like you needed some really intricate arrangement where it just happened to by coincidence spell out a very lengthy series where it would just be interested in hearing like Troy's last word on this one if you have something to say.
Yeah. I might have to think about it some more because I'm not sure exactly the inferential structure of this case, but I'm inclined to think just given there's sort of plausibility of the stuff I said already, it's going to fall into one of the two cases. Either it is going to be something that wouldn't offer any further support, or it would in the same way that I think the star rating case in the standard way does. But I'd have to think about some more and have.
Yeah, I guess I'll just this case strikes me as really decisive. But yeah, definitely more to be said. Sorry, go.
Okay, go on. Pick some simplicity topic or something like that.
Well, I really wanted to cover the one. I mean, I guess it's related to simplicity, but when I gave it an example where I had a slide where it said something like, well, suppose a fine tuning argument was sound, and then we update on the fact that M, where M is a statement of the exact, physical constants and such. You recall, we end up having to say that the prior on design and M is orders of magnitude more like higher than the prior on non-design and M, and that seemed to me like almost a matter of like trivial truth that it's wrong, that it's not orders of magnitude more likely. And if I recall right, you reported having the opposite intuition.
I happily bite the bullet. It doesn't even feel like a bullet, it feels like a delicious treat made of
yeah. I mean, as I said in my presentation, so would you, I gave that example of someone going up to the cosmologist and saying like, oh, I have this further theory that's posits a further cause at the beginning. It's pretty simple, and it's disposed to produce that sort of universe. And so, you should reject your theory and accept mine, or at least think that mine is orders of magnitude more likely. The theory is just that there is that sort of particle that's a cause of the universe, rather than there's the universe but no cause. But they agree otherwise on what the universe is like.
sorry, so the theory is there's a particle that caused the initial conditions of the universe versus that there were the initial
Well, I
conditions.
phrase it as a particle that caused the universe, but if you want to phrase it as causing the initial conditions, whatever, it's for all intents and purposes is the same. Whatever way you think that designer caused the universe, whether it's the universe.
Well, but I think conditional on there being a particle that causes something, there's no reason to think it's any likelier that the particle would cause the universe rather than that the universe would just exist. So I think the same things that go into that go like the same probability distribution you'll have over priors of initial conditions of universes will also be what you'll have over the probability that a particle would make different arrangements.
No, but I can sort of build it into the theory. Maybe it's part of what it means to be a particle of this sort, that it has this sort of disposition. And you might think that adding in that it has that sort of disposition isn't a significant cost to like simplicity or something like that.
Yeah, well,
maybe it's a bit more cost than you would on your perfect being theist. Theory,
so then I think if you have a more specific theory, it'll explain the data very well, but it'll just lose that precisely in terms of priors.
Yeah, but the thought with this example was that it gains a lot in terms of expectation, but it doesn't really sacrifice all that much in terms of the sort of simplicity and so on that you would think is relevant to priors. Like, I don't know, is a particle that's disposed to create a universe, or at least somewhat disposed to create a universe that's life permitting, is that adding in that disposition a giant cost to the simplicity of the theory? It's not
a giant cost to the simplicity. I guess it's a giant cost to modesty, because now it requires, like, there are lots of different things that the particles could bring about. The odds they would be that specific thing are very low. I think particles are importantly different from agents in that agents act for reasons, and so it's much more likely that there would be an agent who's motivated to bring about life than that there would be a particle who just, like, by coincidence brings about life.
Yeah, so you think that it's orders of magnitude more likely that it's an agent that does it than that there's a particle that does it?
Yes. For example, I think an agent made our universe, and I think that I believe in God. I don't have a sizable credence in there being a particle that just pooped our universe into existence. I mean, there are lots of cases where we think that the theory that an agent did something is orders of magnitude more likely than the theory that the thing just happened by chance. Like, famous watch example. The odds an agent made a watch are much higher than the odds that a watch just existed by chance. And so if there are lots of cases that are like this, I don't see what's so crazy about thinking that that upon observing that there's something ridiculously improbable and special about our initial conditions. Sorry, about I guess our initial conditions too, but the constants were the main thing I was talking about, that it's orders of magnitude more likely that an agent would do it. All you have to think is that the odds that given, if you hold our law structure in the background, all you have to think is that the odds that conditional on there being an agent of some sort who made our universe, the odds that they'd make the constants be life permitting are not astronomically improbable on the order of 1 in Google. And that strikes me as a very modest claim and a very reasonable claim.
Yeah, so I'm fine with that conditional probability for at least certain design hypotheses. I wouldn't grant it for design generally. I mean, and again, as I said in my presentation, even if I did grant it for design generally, I could weaken the relation to something like cause or correlate with or predict or whatever. But then you might disagree with premise 1. We don't have time to get into that move here, I assume. But I guess I don't know how much we want to go further on this point or in general, but I want to, I guess, just sum up our main disagreement on this part anyway. Is just that, like, it's sort of non-negotiable for me to repeat when I'm thinking about these theories and imagine all of causal reality. I mean, maybe this is an idealization. Okay, I'm going to sound like...
Okay, I just imagined
when you compare the theories, right? When you imagine all of causal reality, and if we had two theories which agreed on every aspect of causal reality, except yours had one more cause at the beginning, and maybe that cause was pretty simple, and positing that cause itself, at least moderately predicted that the rest of causal reality would have some feature. If you want to say, well, prior to looking at any of the data, that theory is like many orders of magnitude more probable. I'm sorry, I don't know what to say. I mean, that's just like so radically different from how I would approach it. That seems like they're almost the same theory. Just look at one more cause. Like I don't get it. Maybe it's just an intuition that I don't share, or approach.
Yeah, I absolutely don't share this intuition, and I think I think the made by God case can help illustrate this. That before, look like the odds that the initial conditions would just by chance spell out made by God with love in every language, that it would just happen to be that particular sequence of shapes, the odds are astronomically lower in terms of priors. It seems to me, at least, that would happen than that. I feel like that we have this sort of nice, fairly consistent trend of cases where it's licit, where you're allowed to think that it's way likelier that an agent brought about X than that X happened by chance, which is when the odds of X happening by chance are ridiculously unlikely, and you can glimpse some reason why an agent might want to bring about X. And then if we just do that with the initial condition, with the constants, well, it strikes me like I don't think the odds of them wanting finely tuned constant are on the order of 1 in Google. And it would seem like it would take an outrageously powerful argument to conclude that the odds of the prior probability of the conjunct of the disjunct of all the different designers who might create finely tuned constants, who might make the cosmological constant be the value it is. It strikes me, you just need an outrageously powerful argument, to my mind, to think that the odds of those designers in conjunction are on the order of 1 in Google.
Yeah, the problem with that is when you say glimpsing some reason to think that a designer would have that reason, then we're coming back to the stuff about, well, what is it that's motivating that reason? Is it something empirical? In which case, we're going to go back to the double counting thing, on my view.
Yeah,
but then
let's
we're not going to go back to that discussion about that.
Yeah, let's move on. The final thing that we're gonna discuss is simplicity. So, Troy, how about you respond? And I really want to limit this to maybe like 5 to 10 minutes, so that we can finish in a timely manner. So, Troy, how about you engage with Matthew a little bit on that point?
Well, okay. I mean, so how would you prefer to think about simplicity and priors? I mean, so I brought up a couple issues related to just thinking about the simplicity of a theory in terms of the ontological commitments of the theory.
Yeah, so I think what I don't have I think there are different ways of doing simplicity. I don't know exactly what the way is. I don't even know if there is some objective formula for calculating the simplicity of different theories. But I think some relevant considerations have to do with the number of entities, the number of kinds of entities that are fundamental. Sorry, I think that's sort of the important thing. And has to do with sort of how if you invoked only fundamental entities in some ideal language, how long would it take you to describe them all? So then theism strikes me as a pretty simple hypothesis. It's just a hypothesis that you take one of the fundamental things, minds, and you instantiate it with totally without limit. So it's a very simple hypothesis. One thing, one essential property, and one of the simplest kinds of things instantiated totally without limit. That's a very simple hypothesis, I think, and very elegant, non-arbitrary, etc. So one point I just want to make briefly, a theory that's really simple and elegant and non-arbitrary, even if it's very immodest, is often worth believing, right? So the theory that the laws are uniform throughout the universe is way less modest than the theory that the laws break down in some random patch. But nonetheless, we should not think the laws break down in any random patch throughout the universe, because even though that theory is way more modest, it's so much more arbitrary and complex that just adding an extra epicycle, that's actually a real cost, So anyways, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm fine with the cases of the laws of nature. Actually, I have more to say about that, but it's perfectly compatible with what I want to say about the present case. So when you say that the initial thing here is relatively simple, maybe it's one entity, one sort of fundamental entity, maybe one property. It's it has few properties, or at least few fundamental properties, and so on. That's fine. But when all is said and done, right, that thing is going to create more things, and those things are going to have their own sort of complexity. Unless you think the complexity of things that it creates don't add to the complexity of the theory, they don't detract from.
Oh yeah, I do think that. Yes, I definitely think that. So then
by hand. So then the complexity of the theory is just based on what, the complexity of the initial thing?
Yeah, of the unexplained things. And let me give sort of an intuition pump. So imagine you have some coin that has the propensity to imagine this coin was the fundamental thing. This coin plus a hand that flipped it were the two fundamental things. And the coin is such that if it comes up heads, it creates just this vast panoply of different and very complicated entities. And if the coin comes up tails, it created simpler stuff or something. Just to make sure there are no anthropic biases, let's say in both cases it would create just one copy of humans, but then if it comes up heads, it would also create like a bunch of non-conscious, really random and complicated stuff. I don't think simplicity considerations should lead you to think at more than 50% odds that the coin came up heads. And certainly if the coin hasn't yet been flipped, I think definitely that you shouldn't think at more than 50% odds that the coin will come up tails, if that just means less stuff gets created.
Yeah, well, if you think it's genuinely a matter of a genuinely chancy process, whether it comes up heads or tails, and there's like such that, like in the background possibility space, half the worlds of which it comes, roughly half the worlds it comes up head, this happens, and half the worlds it comes up tails, that happens. That is going to affect things in a way that I don't think it's affected here, but I don't know how much I want to.
I'm just saying that if you had a preference for simplicity, then that would shift you away from the 50% credence given by it being a mere chancy process. Because then you'd say, well, no, I have extra evidence that's not just the bare 50% probability, namely that it would result in extra complexity in theories that are more complex or worse.
No, but what I'm saying is that if the data about the fairness of the coin, if we're understanding that to have like modal import, is going to screen off the evidential relevance of the stuff that I brought up. So
I don't see why it would. Because you normally, the default is thinking coins have a 50% chance of coming up heads. But if the theory on which they came up heads ends up being more metaphysically extravagant, right? So like if there's a coin that's flipped, but basically like, and whether it comes up heads or tails is determined in some way by the initial conditions, but basically like the simpler theories mean initial conditions where it's more likely to come up heads, and the more complex ones mean initial conditions where it's more likely to come up tails. You should favor the theories in which it will come up heads.
Well, wait, then it's all going to come down to what our evidence is that it's fair. If we don't have good evidence that it's fair, then I might be disposed to think that it's more likely to come up tails or heads or whatever it is.
Sorry, so don't call it. Don't think about it as like right. So there, I don't think we need to build in that it's fair. We can just build in like the disposition is right, because if what you mean by fair is just that it's fixed at 50% probability, right? Okay, that'll fix things. But you can imagine some process that you would otherwise suspect is fair, right? So imagine basically like Joe is going to flip a coin in 5 minutes, and God decides to, if the coin comes up heads, create a bunch of stuff. Or sorry, not in 5 minutes. Imagine your great-great-great-grandfather just flipped a coin, basically. And before he flipped a coin, God appeared to him in a cloud of smoke and sulfur and said to him, if the coin comes up heads, I'll make lots of really complicated stuff. And if it comes up tails, I won't. I think then you should think, no, there's more than 50%. There's a 50% chance it came up heads. But I think the other theory would say that there's more than 50% chance it came up heads because, you should have a bias in favor of simpler worlds.
Yeah. So there's a few things to mention here. One is, again, there's two sort of features that I haven't really talked about all that much. One is going to be, what is our bias towards simplicity? Are we actually biased towards there being fewer things or fewer fundamental things? If anything, actually, the approach that I gave, if you at least interpret it naively, didn't have that, didn't assume that. And there being fewer things or fewer fundamental things in itself was not an indication of simplicity on my approach. But like supposing that it was, and then that informed priors, then, how that affected this case would depend on how strongly we're convinced that it's fair or not. I don't.
But I wasn't stipulating that the coin was fair. I was just stipulating that basically, I was stipulating a setup where you would otherwise, where it would be otherwise reasonable to think at a 50% chance that it came up heads. But, and sorry, to be clear, it strikes me as very strange that simplicity considerations should influence your judgment about what a being is likely to do, where you're like, no, you probably won't do lots of creating, because then that would be really complicated if the being can create. Because no, your credence in the being creating should just be a function of how likely you think it is the being would have the motivation to create. Because the number of things that exist if they create shouldn't matter. You shouldn't think if God's about to create a world and you think, probably he'll make that world, and then you're like, oh wait, actually the world would be filled with lots of complicated things. assuming that doesn't bear on any axiological evaluation of it. It strikes me as very strange to think that that lowers the probability. Now, regarding the other point, you were saying that you think that you don't think there's a bias towards just there being less stuff. So I think if there's not a bias towards less stuff, it's hard to see why you shouldn't believe all sorts of outlandish hypotheses like that. I don't know, there's just an uncaused, uncreated particle in the center of the Milky Way that exists, or that there's just an infinite number of invisible particles of some particular sort, or that, a tiger won't pop into my room 2 seconds from now. I rule those out because, no, that would add new stuff to the world that has no deeper explanation. But
yeah. So to be clear, what I said was that it's my approach doesn't assume that there's some bias towards simplicity in this sense. In fact, I actually do think I do myself have a bias towards simplicity in the sense. I don't find it that easy to motivate though, because actually I think there's some reasons to think there probably are a lot more things than I would maybe want on my landscape. But yeah, I mean, I have this. It's just I find it intuitive to me that, like, for example, most of the things that could exist do not, and that sort of biases me towards thinking like, well, does this thing exist? The sort of default is going to be probably not. But
yeah, I feel like that's all you need for simplicity of the sort.
Yeah. So that's something that I affirm myself, but it's sort of like it's sort of difficult. I don't see how to motivate someone who just doesn't accept something like that.
Well, I think that they won't be able to trust induction. So
yeah.
Now, if they're fine with that, okay.
Well, let's not get into induction. I do have to leave for dinner quite soon, so maybe we could just get some closing remarks. Don't try to introduce anything new, but like if you want to summarize something, if you want to give edification or words of wisdom to my wonderful audience. Basically, I'll give you guys some final, maybe 30 to 60 second segments.
Yeah, so I think, thanks for having me, Joe. And yeah, thanks for doing this. I think we basically covered the important issues. I guess I'll just reiterate that, number one, I think that the made by God case, particularly the version that I gave towards the end, where you needed for it to spell out made by God with love in every human language back to back in order for life to arise, that strikes me as relevantly similar to fine tuning. I don't think it was double counting for the reasons that were explained. And I think so long as you start out thinking that the prior probability of there being some designer of some sort who would make a finely tuned universe is not outrageously low, which I think there's actually like many different reasons to think the probability is not outrageously low, then I think you ought to think that it's pretty likely that there's a God of some sort in virtue of the design, in virtue of fine tuning of the constants. But yeah, so that's it. Many more issues to discuss, of course. But yeah, thanks for having me. Anyways, later.
Yeah, so I assume there'll be some more discussions or potentially blog posts from both sides on this. So hopefully we can cover more either private exchange or in our posts. Yeah, so just to cover again, on my argument, bare design doesn't more strongly predict type permitted conditions and isn't more likely antecedently than bare non-design. And we can infer from that when we update on L, bare design or any more specific design hypothesis is not more likely than non-design. And we went through a bunch of different issues and objections that might be made. I think we really didn't go that deeply on all of them. I think with the star writing case, my point was, yeah, that would be fine in that inference. It would not be fine in the fine-tuning case. I'm quite confident that as a matter of double counting. I'm not sure what to say about some of the other cases that were presented. I'd have to kind of write that down and think about that through probabilistically, but I think it's either going to fall into one category or the other, the sort of fine case or the double counting case. And regarding simplicity, yeah, we didn't really get into a huge conversation, but I think I decently motivated some of the way that I would prefer to think about it. And the one area where we seemed to come to just radically different intuitions about that was on priors for cases like, well, there's this exact universe and it was designed versus there's this exact universe and it was not designed. I think that the design one should not have orders of magnitude more like higher prior than the other one. That just seems like ridiculous to me, but at the end of the day, it's not so easy to resolve such differences. So yeah, I think a few more things I could say, but I'll wrap it up there. Thanks for having me, Joe, and Matthew, for discussing. It's been interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much. And I'd be totally happy to do a part 2. This has been a lot of fun. Certainly much more fun and edifying than the Dillahunty debate, for example.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, thankfully, Troy did not deny any theorems of probability.
Oh, wait. Hang on. Matthew, have you considered the fact that there's only one universe? So we can't have more data about what what's likely to be because we only have one.
And this is, also, this is just the paradigm of God of the gaps reasoning. We have a gap in our understanding of physics, and you just plug God in, and boom.
How is this better than the theory that a magic pixie farted out the universe?
That's
I can't think of any difference.
That's my favorite hypothesis.
It's basically the same. You just said it's the same picture. I don't know.
Right, exactly. Okay, well, anyway, audience, if you made it this far, you probably love the video. So smash that like button, turn on that little bell for notifications, support Matthew's Substack, support Troy's Patreon, support my Patreon, right?
In that order.
Yeah, right.
In that order.
Yeah. Sign up to my Patreon for like the $200 tier, which doesn't exist, but you can make it exist. So right now, go and just give us all of your money because we're all just total grifters completely. Who wouldn't be in this climate? No, but anyway, thank you, Troy and Matthew, for coming on. And audience, check out the links in the description to their blog posts and all that stuff. And what better way to end is there than I'm Joe Schmid. This is The Majesty of Reason, and peace out.
Well, this mad world that made me crazy. Might just turn around to 180. I ain't politicking, I ain't kissing no babies. The devil on my doorstep being so shady. Don't trip. We don't gotta let him in. Don't trip. Yeah. I let it go, but I never go with it. Yeah, okay, cool as fall weather. The bullshit, I'm here to make it all better with a little music for you. I don't do enough for you without you. It's the color blue. Oh, don't trip. I was in the city, they was talking that shit. Had the homies with me, all of a sudden they split. We ain't even worried, we just laughing, that's rich. You know how it goes, it ain't broke, don't fix. Hey, one of these days we'll all get by. Don't be afraid, don't fall. Think I lost my mind. Reality so hard to find. When the devil tryna call your line, shit, I always shine. Even when the light dim. No, I ain't God, but I'm feeling just like him. Oh, don't trip. See, I was in the whip riding me and my bitch. We was listening to us, no one else, that's it. That's the flesh, just a bit. Let me talk my shit, say my head got big. Yeah, well, this mad world that made me crazy. Might just turn around to 180. I ain't politicking, I ain't kissing no babies. The devil on my doorstep being so shady. Don't trip. We don't gotta let him in. Don't trip. Yeah. I let it go, but I never go with it. Don't trip. Don't trip. Don't trip. Well, if you could see me now, love me, then hold me down my mind. It goes. Well, this mad world that made me crazy. Might just turn around to 180. I ain't politicking, I ain't kissing no babies. The devil on my doorstep being so shady. Don't trip. We don't gotta let him in. Don't trip. Yeah. I let it go, but I never go with it.